When it was first introduced to you, you made a statement about turnkey tyranny. What did you mean by that?
It means that even if you trust the government today, what happens when it changes? And in our democracy, we're never more than 8 years away from a total change of government. Suddenly, everybody is vulnerable to this individual, and the systems are already in place. What happens tomorrow, in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, when eventually we get an individual who says, you know what? Let's flip that switch and use the absolute full extent of our technical capabilities to ensure the political stability of this new administration.
Oh, shit! You saw a
Yes,
plane?
I just saw a plane go into the building.
As you look at the picture from our chopper now arriving at the scene, Jim Friedel in Hoboken said it appeared to bank sharply and smash directly, perhaps purposefully, into, oh my goodness,
Oh, God.
there's another one. Oh my goodness, there's another one.
This seems to be on purpose.
Oh my goodness, now it's obvious, I think, that there's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack of proportions that we cannot begin to imagine at this juncture.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world.
Are you afraid?
It was passed in the wake of 9/11 and calls for new and vast powers for US intelligence agencies understandably had lots of backing. The reforms, known as the Patriot Act, according to President Bush, were designed to prevent another attack like the one on September 11th. It essentially gave organisations like the NSA more access to internet records, made it easier to tap phones, and made it easier to share intelligence information.
Today we take an essential step in defeating terrorism while protecting the constitutional rights of all Americans.
US politicians who penned the law knew that there was a fine line between the right to privacy and keeping American citizens safe. So a 5-year sunset clause was inserted into the act. It was routinely renewed until shocking revelations by Edward Snowden threw a giant spanner into the works.
They also found that they unreasonably intrude into the private lives of ordinary citizens, individuals who have never been suspected of any wrongdoing or criminal activity.
Since then, the mass surveillance debate has raged on, and the revelations revealed by Mr. Snowden brought into question how useful such widespread powers actually are. Snowden announced the Patriot Act was secretly being used to justify the collection of phone records from millions of Americans. But the expired law is likely to be replaced as early as this week with new legislation, the USA Freedom Act, as it's been claimed the US is at risk without such laws.
Are you afraid?
The act has cross-party support and is backed by President Obama.
Terrorists like Al-Qaeda and ISIL aren't suddenly going to stop plotting against us at midnight tomorrow. And we shouldn't surrender the tools that help keep us safe. It would be irresponsible.
It would scale back the bulk collection of phone records by the NSA, but they would still be able to get the data from phone companies.
Is anyone even paying attention?
Now, here's the problem, of course, is that 702 is set to sunset at the end of the year. And if Congress does nothing to reauthorize, it will die. But they have done something. They've introduced the USA Liberty Act, which I don't know why they keep doing this, Patrick. Maybe you have an idea, but the Patriot Act was unpatriotic. They fixed it with the Freedom Act, which restricted our freedom, and now they're adding the Liberty Act, which the premise is that somehow liberty means giving up your right to privacy. I think Orwell was probably smiling or crying. But Patrick, if you can give us a little bit of a background on 702, what is it, what's it about, what's the history of it, and where are we now?
The problem with this bill is it allows the government to continue to maintain my data, your data, anybody's data who has contacted by phone or through the email or text message folks overseas, essentially for at least 90 days. And there's a waiver requirement that would allow them, to keep it on an individualized basis for basically an indefinite period of time. So as I like to say, oftentimes in Washington, this is a perfect example of let's not but say we did. They're trying to say that they're reforming these surveillance authorities, but at the end of the day, this bill is a sham.
So the idea that 702 will expire at the end of the year, 702 enables them to mass collect our communications if we happen to be communicating with someone overseas. What would happen if nothing happened? What would happen if they didn't do anything? The claim is, of course, it would be the end of the world. Terrorism would run rampant through the United States, and we'd be reduced to, primitive existence.
Well, it's important to remember that these mass surveillance programs, whether we talk Stellar Wind or the Section 215 Patriot Act program, commonly referred to as either the business record section or the library provision, both of those programs were complete failures. They never stopped an attack on this country. They were constitutionally violative, and they wasted literally millions and millions of taxpayer dollars. And in my judgment, this program and the 702 program has been no different. And I think it was very revealing, Daniel, that at the end of September, when the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of NSA, and folks over at the Department of Justice, they put on this big push with the press here in Washington. They brought them to a special pen and pad, a kind of a semi-off-the-record thing, where they allegedly revealed some additional examples of 702 supposedly being this big success. And they did not produce a single example of 702 stopping a terrorist attack on this country. Not a single one. So the idea that if this program goes away, we're somehow going to be laid waste by ISIS wannabes is just another example of the kind of post 9/11 fear-mongering that we really need to get past.
Stand up for your liberty while you still have it. Tweet your congressman and the president.
First introduced to you, you made a statement about turnkey tyranny. What did you mean by that?
It means that even if you trust the government today, what happens when it changes? And in our democracy, we're never more than 8 years away from a total change of government. Suddenly, everybody is vulnerable to this individual, and the systems are already in place. What happens tomorrow, in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, when eventually we get an individual who says, you know what? Let's flip that switch and use the absolute full extent of our technical capabilities to ensure the political stability of this new administration. When we think about the future and where we go from here, the question is, are we going to change and enter sort of a quantified world where everywhere you've been, everyone you talk to, it's indexed, it's analyzed, it's stored, and it's used maybe against you?
Within our technologies here, we have our license plate reader system, which can capture dozens of license plates in a matter of a second.
Or will we recognize the danger of that and embrace the fact that people should have space to make mistakes without judgment, to have sort of the unconsidered thought or conversation with your friend? But if that was recorded in a database where, now you say, I think Donald Trump should be kicked off a cliff, and Donald Trump becomes president someday, sure, and everybody who said that ends up getting thrown off a cliff. That's a very dangerous world. And I think this really is the question that our political structures are not yet comfortable even discussing. But whether they like it or not, it's a world that's coming, and we're going to have to confront.
Please share this video on the USA Anti-Liberty Act. Follow my other social media. Don't forget to click the bell.